Crowd control abilities are those which impede enemies, preventing them from attacking or interfering with an objective. While crowd control abilities can deal damage, that is secondary to crowd control itself. Practically every frame has some form of crowd control, so it can be hard to nail down who does what best. So, if you're getting ready to focus on crowd control, I've got for you the best options for various types of control. I'm the Engineer, let's solve a practical problem. I'm going to break this down into a few categories of crowd control, based on the different ways you can go about it. What's key to note is that I'm focusing on crowds. Sure, Valkyr can yeet an enemy out of place when she wants to, but that doesn't scale up. The categories to cover then are freezes, stuns, traps, slows, and then a couple extras. Freezes are crowd controls which stop the enemy entirely, sometimes even maintaining their alertness state. In this group, there are several options to go through. Baruk uses his lull ability to put an entire room to sleep, though it takes a few moments to kick in. It's wide-reaching, cheap to cast, and resets alertness on enemies. Most builds, however, will dump the duration on lull, sacrificing this crowd control to empower his restraint drain for more time using Serene Storm. The augment for the lull will make the ability last longer, and causes a free recast if you do a finisher on a sleeping enemy. Equinox uses her Night Form's rest ability to put small clusters of enemies to sleep. It's a good duration with a very high cast range, but affecting a small burst around the targeted spot instantly. This maintains current alertness levels, which is good for stealth farming. The augment for rest causes it to spread to unaffected enemies nearby when an affected enemy is killed. Atlas uses his Petrify for a high range cone of petrification. This is again instant incapacitation and maintains current alertness levels. The ability is somewhat expensive to cast, and setting up for a good use of this ability will mean sacrificing either strength or efficiency. As a bonus though, you can equip the Orgaze augment for codex scans and loot bonuses. Gara can freeze enemies by using Mass Vitrify to turn them into glass. Don't worry, they don't become the targeting nightmare that Nora's Glassmaker enemies can be. Instead, the enemies caught in the expanding glass wall during the cast will be slowed to a halt, encased in glass. The resulting glass barrier can also be used to zone enemies out of your controlled area, providing a blocking form of crowd control. Frost also, unsurprisingly, can freeze enemies using his Avalanche ability. In a fair radius around him, enemies succumb to the icy wave and are held in place with their armour reduced. Throw in the augment to give Frost and his allies a knockoff Iron Skin based on the number of enemies hit. Cora freezes enemies using her Ensnare ability. Cast it on one enemy to get the ball rolling, and moments later, any other nearby enemy will get chained up and pulled closer to the first one. The pull isn't the strongest, but the enemies will still be incapacitated entirely by the chains. Hildren freezes enemies by lifting them up using her Aegis Storm ability. While channeling this ability, Hildren creates a sphere around her in which enemies are lifted and held in place, either for easy kills or as a source of energy for her allies. Previously you couldn't keep this forever on your own, but the new Rebuild Shields ability from Helminth works while hovering, allowing indefinite use. Lastly, Limbo can freeze enemies using his Stasis ability. Any enemy in the Rift, due to banishment or cataclysm, is frozen in place while Stasis is active, regardless of the distance from Limbo. This is an extremely powerful crowd control ability, frequently nerfed or denied by DE for being too good. Stuns differ from freezes in that they are often much shorter and do not fully halt enemies, instead interrupting what they're doing. Volt's best stun ability is his Discharge. This is a wide-reaching damage and stun ability. Enemies hit by initial burst or shortly after become stunned conduits of electricity. Some enemies can occasionally ignore the stunning effects of this, but overall this will shut down a room in short order, for a brief time. Survivors can be picked off with ease. Slap on the augment to greatly overcharge ally shields in the process. Protea can stun enemies using a stagger effect from her grenade fan ability. Each orb thrown creates a slashing zone which will repeatedly stagger enemies entering the zone. There's seemingly no limit to how many of these can be active at once, so set them up and knock them down. Wisp carries a blinding stun with Breach Surge. With a quick explosion of solar energy, Wisp causes nearby enemies to be dazzled for the duration. This can be cast doubly by having Will-O-Wisp active at the same time, with the second surge cast from the spectral copy itself. And by casting it from a distance at a reservoir of Wisps, Wisp will teleport over to emit a surge with twice the original radius. For added goodness, enemies struck while under the effects of Breach Surge will emit radiation sparks, which can add to the fun using rad procs. Banshee has a couple stuns up her sleeves. Does she have sleeves? Well, she has stuns, that's what matters. First is Silence. This creates a deafening aura around Banshee, which will briefly stun enemies when they contact this aura. While the stun is brief, enemies can be affected multiple times by moving away from them, then coming back. In this way, a low range silence can be more effective than a large range one, allowing you to easily re-affect the nearby enemies. But if subtlety ain't your trick, Banshee can slam the ground using Soundquake. Unaugmented, this causes a repeat stagger on all affected enemies within range, repeatedly stunning them. However, if you augment the ability, this stagger is lost in place of a full knockback effect. Third on the docket are trap abilities, which manhandle enemies within a specified area. They're not staying put like a freeze, and the abilities tend to be more long lasting than stuns. Korra makes use of her Strangle Dome as a trap, blocking off potentially a huge area with a dome of living chains, snatching up enemies in a considerable radius. The dome is limited in the number of occupants, also readily enough kills captured targets to free up slots. Use this with her augment to get extra loot from the trap targets. Nidus traps using his Lava ability. Exploding in a mass of tentacles, lava will grab nearby enemies and attempt to pull them into a tight clump at the centre of where lava was cast. This will grapple through terrain, but it cannot pull the enemies through those obstacles, leaving some trapped enemies out of the centre point. For a relatively cheap ability, this is a fast way to group up enemies for a modest duration. Vauban can trap in a couple ways, but its true crowd control trap is the Vortex form of Bastille. Hold casting his fourth ability will create a suctioning vortex, capturing and ragdolling enemies that dare to come within range. Cast once for enemies to be drawn violently in, while a second nearby cast can cause ridiculous flight paths of ragdolled enemies. Hydroid is just pure trap crowd control. Use Tempest Barrage to slam projectiles into the selected area, knocking down enemies, and if you add in the augment, you can also inflict corrosive procs. Use Tidal Surge to bundle up and ragdoll nearby enemies in a surging dash. You can use Undertow to become the trap yourself and sucker in enemies to drown in your puddle form. This can actively grab enemies by targeting them and pressing your primary fire button. And lastly, use Tentacle Swarm to deny a whole area with the Kraken. Enemies in that zone can be lifted by tentacles, harming them over time and removing them from the fight as they're swung around recklessly. Throw on the augment for even more loot from the kills. Mag is our final trap style frame. Unlike the others, she doesn't incapacitate the enemies, instead creating a bubble on a target to suck in nearby enemies and hold them, and their bullets, together. Trapped enemies will struggle to move around, while taking damage from any projectile fired within or into the bubble. This does stop working when the original target dies, so it's most effective on tankier targets. Next then, slowing. This category is super simple to understand, simply slowing the enemy down. I'm going to be skipping over frames that cause just cold procs, and that gives us these following options. Nova can slow enemies using her Molecular Prime ability. This radial discharge of antimatter will slow enemies down and make them all sparkly, ready to explode on death. The higher your strength, the harsher the slow. Notably, this ability can be inverted with a suitably low power strength to actually speed enemies up. if your control requires enemies to hurry up and come die already. Equinox can also cause a slowing effect when using Pacify with its augment. As allies take damage in the aura, nearby enemies become slowed. Once charged, the slowing effect remains constant, affecting any new enemies approaching, that is until the aura is stopped, such as by switching forms. Valkyria slows enemies using her Warcry ability. She gets faster, enemies get slower. It's a pretty fair trade. While it is rather expensive to cast, the augment for this ability allows you to keep the duration going by extending it with additional melee kills. That's better more for the buff than it is for the slowing effect, as it won't cast a new slow on new enemies, but it's still something to note. Lastly, I want to touch on a couple other major options that don't fit the above main categories. Revenant can turn and distract a large number of enemies thanks to Enthrall. This ability turns one enemy into a temporary ally, and causes them to spread the effect to other enemies up to a limit of 7. This takes a lot of the enemy attention away from you and your objective through distraction. While Necros can do similar, I'm calling out Revenant specifically, as it not only uses the living enemies against themselves, rather than trying to recreate new ones, it is free to use on enemies which have been stunned by Mesmer Skin. And finally, Loki can disrupt a vast area using Radial Disarm. Enemies are neither slowed nor trapped, instead all of them lose any ranged weaponry, reducing them to cleavers, batons, or in the case of mowers, kicks. As it's neither damaging nor tanking, I consider this a special form of crowd control by reducing the effective threatening range of all enemies, and nicely convincing them to enter the meat grinder. Alrighty then, so that covers the major players in this arena of crowd control. As I mentioned, basically every frame can manipulate the enemies in some way, from knocking them down with Gorse to distracting them away with Octavia, but these ones are my main considerations. Chances are, if I've not touched on your favourite frame here where you'd expect them, there's just going to be a better option going. Over the last few months, I've covered a lot of roles you can build for in Warframe. Got nukes, healers, speed, flight, stealth, damage, loot, tank and armour stripping, as well as now crowd control. If there's another role you're curious about, I would like to know more, let me know down in the comments. And of course, if you've enjoyed this video or this series, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to catch more as it goes live. For now though, stun folks, slow rooms, and fight well, Tenno.
Dissection.
I left a present on the way.
Present could you have left?
A dissection? No. That sounds...
What is this?
It's my social distancing bubble.
I love it.